Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin the final, second last session. I guess the wear and tear is beginning to show on me too. This session is entitled The Allies and Post-War Ukrainian Political Refugees. What we wanted to do in this session was to examine the issue of whether or not these people who came after the Second World War, and specifically Ukrainian displaced persons and political refugees, were admitted into the country without the full knowledge of their background, be it political, criminal, or whatever, into Canada specifically, but also into the United States. I'm very pleased to have with us today on our panel two experts, one from as far away as Kentucky, who recently wrote what can be considered to be one of the most definitive works called Ponds of Yalta on the whole issue of forced repatriation and the Allies. So let me begin immediately without further introduction by introducing and asking Professor Mark Elliott from Kentucky to address us.
Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. I feel that it is a special honor, not only because I'm from out of the country, but out of the community. But I feel a certain sympathy for the suffering of the Second World War, and I suppose in part that's how I first got interested in the question of displacement and repatriation in World War II, even though I have no ethnic connection with the question. I want to say that my paper will serve basically as a bridge between the previous topic and actually the one announced, because what I hope to talk about in general is placing the Ukrainian element of the collaboration issue within the larger context of all ethnic groups from the Soviet Union that were involved in one way or another with the Germans. World War II, with its 30 million fatalities, exacted the largest human toll of any military conflict in history. The fighting also scattered nations to the wind as never before. Estimates of civilians made homeless, some 40 million, are greater than for any other war. In Europe alone, the fighting made refugees of some 30 million persons. The Soviet Union, with not only 20 plus million dead, but 20 million more displaced, witnessed the largest human upheaval of any country in World War II. While Siberia and Central Asia received 12 million civilians fleeing European Russia, Germany took well over 8 million Soviet POWs and forced laborers in the opposite direction. The size of the captive population stemmed in part from the speed with which motorized Wehrmacht divisions devoured Soviet territory. The German blitzkrieg advanced from the frontier in late June to the suburbs of Moscow by December 1941 and benefited from Stalin's self-defeating stand-fast orders, which contributed to the needless capture of millions of Soviet soldiers. In addition, many soldiers disenchanted with the Soviet regime surrendered voluntarily. The Wehrmacht simply overwhelmed the Red Army in the first months of fighting, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners at a time. 300,000 at the Battle of Smolensk in mid-July, an astounding 650,000 in the Kiev encirclement in late September. In 1941, the Germans captured between 3 and 4 million members of the Red Army. For the entire war, perhaps 5.75 million. Although a Soviet demographer claims Red Army personnel perished by the thousands, in reality the deaths ran into the millions among POWs. Rosenberg, German commissioner for the East European region, complained to Field Marshal Keitel as early as February 1942 that of 3.6 million Soviet prisoners, only several hundred thousand are fully capable of working. The overwhelming majority had perished. Belated, grudging improvements in prisoner treatment ultimately saved some souls from extinction, but fatalities in this lost Soviet army of POWs, mostly in the winter of 1941-42, still numbered between 2 and 3 million persons. Germany's inhumane treatment of millions of Soviet POWs ranks among the worst atrocities of a war replete with them. The disaster resulted from deliberate, systematic destruction, neglect, and the lack of international protection for prisoners on the Eastern Front. The Nazis methodically singled out special categories for extinction. The most certain to perish were Communist Party members, military commissars, Jews, and the ill-defined category of intellectuals. Given Nazi loathing of Slavs, being Russian or Ukrainian offered little protection, however. Camp commandants often refused to allow civilian donations of food to starving prisoners. This and the primitive conditions in POW compounds came as the first great shock to the population of the occupied regions. If starvation did not overcome the hapless captive, lack of protection from the elements, physical abuse, or epidemics might as well prove lethal. In the first year of fighting in the East, almost all prisoner compounds suffered at least 30% fatalities, and in some, the rate of attrition approached 95%. The lack of legal protection under existing international agreements also perhaps contributed to the plight of Soviet POWs. The USSR had not signed the 1929 Geneva Prisoner of War Convention, nor had it formally ratified the 1899 or the 1907 Hague Conventions on Land Warfare. Soviet spokesmen had claimed Moscow's adherence to the turn-of-the-century treaties and have invoked all three in arguing German criminal responsibility for POW and civilian atrocities, but without mentioning the awkward lack of official accession in every case. How much Soviet adherence to the Hague and Geneva Conventions would have helped the POWs is highly questionable, however. By 1941, Hitler had amply demonstrated his willingness to disregard inconvenient treaties. Besides, Eastern races were not reckoned to be much superior to Jews. As for the ridiculous 100 million Slavs, Hitler declared, we will mold the best of them to the shape that suits us, and we will isolate the rest of them in their own pigsties, and anyone who talks about cherishing the local inhabitant and civilizing him goes straight off into a concentration camp. End of quote. Himmler, powerful chief of the SS, shared the Führer's racial convictions. Der Untermensch, the Subhuman, a pamphlet partially written by Himmler, gives a plain statement of Nazi opinion of Slavs. Whether under the Mongols or Peter or Stalin, this people is born for the yoke. The subhuman, it was explained, resembled a human in certain anatomical respects, but was in reality more closely related to the lower animals, the lower orders of the animal kingdom, and his natural habitat was the swamp. The Germans hindered their own war effort by treating Slavs so much worse than other POWs. The Wehrmacht developed elaborate propaganda to encourage desertion from the Red Army, but the prevailing Untermensch philosophy frequently prevented preferential treatment being accorded to deserters over ordinary POWs. Had it not been for substantial covert opposition to the destruction of Soviet captives, the death rate would have been even higher. Some German officials looked upon the question of decent treatment from a utilitarian perspective. Propaganda chief Goebbels and some of his group, for example, realized that Himmler's crudity in pamphlets like Der Untermensch would deeply insult Soviet captives and cripple Wehrmacht recruitment in POW camps. The Untermensch policy also alarmed intelligence specialist General Galen, who argued that unless there was an end to the subhuman approach to Soviet civilians and POWs, partisan warfare could not be controlled. Also, General Ernst Kirstring fought energetically for a more enlightened policy toward occupied eastern territories. But Kirstring came to head of the Osttruppen, or Eastern Troops of Soviet origin, too late to make more than cosmetic reforms in German treatment of eastern units. Many commanders in the Wehrmacht saved Soviet captives from the harsher regimen of POW camps and Nazi labor drafts by quietly diverting them into auxiliary units. Generally, the greater the distance from Hitler, the greater the likelihood that German officers would regard the Soviet population under its control as a potential for labor. Millions of POWs indeed perished, but the fraction who did survive benefited from individual captors sprinkled through the Wehrmacht who were more utilitarian than racist. Appalling conditions in the camps no doubt simplified matters for Wehrmacht recruiters, since the dangerous step of joining enemy ranks could appeal only to persons in the most hopeless of predicaments. On other occasions, the semblance of voluntary enlistment gave way to conscription, the captors simply handing out German uniforms, even weapons, with only the foolhardy refusing. Nazi Untermensch philosophy, which coldly anticipated POW mistreatment and starvation, was not the only official position accelerating the rate of enlistment among Soviet captives. The Kremlin itself contributed to the movement by washing its hands of yesterday's fighters. An ill-conceived Soviet decree branded all captives as traitors simply for having been taken alive. That information alone made POWs more susceptible to German suggestions that they take up arms against Stalin. The employment of substantial numbers of Soviet prisoners in the German war effort began almost immediately after the surprise attack in June 1941. German troop strength did not equal the Soviet, even at the outset of hostilities, and the Wehrmacht's dramatic advances could not change the fact that early losses were costly, even if Red Army losses were costlier. The invaders' casualties took on dimensions incomparably greater than in earlier campaigns. Up to the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, Wehrmacht progress went unchecked, and victories were sweeping. But German losses for the summer and fall soared, nevertheless, to 800,000. Auxiliary units, or volunteers in these Heavies, quickly became indispensable, constituting in some cases up to 40% of some support formations. At first, the Germans utilized these auxiliaries, or Heavies for short, in non-combat roles, paramilitary maintenance, supply, transport, engineer, and labor battalions. But before the summer was out, Russian volunteers began to appear in regular Wehrmacht combat formations, even small all-Russian and some small, of course, all-Ukrainian and other ethnic minority units under German command. All this movement from POW compounds into Wehrmacht ranks had to be done discreetly, for Hitler's prescriptions were explicit. Commanders bent on circumventing early prohibitions against arming Soviet nationals took care to mislead headquarters. Rather than report all captured enemy personnel, short-handed officers recruited a portion of their catch on the spot, concealing them among their troops and bypassing prisoner compounds altogether. Incidentally, I think this is one reason why estimates of the number of collaborators, if you want to call them that, in German units is going to always be a matter of estimates, because even German commanders were keeping the real story rather quiet on occasion. Some, quote, all German, end quote, units quietly admitted Soviet POWs up to the level of 10 to 15%. In 1942, Hitler reluctantly recognized the presence of ex-Red Army prisoners in German units as a fait accompli. Wary of racial contamination and even more so of redefection, he did, however, prohibit the formation of any large-scale Russian forces. This viewpoint prevailed until Nazi advances turned into retreats. And when the Germans began to ignore the original restrictions, they turned first to units of Soviet minority nationalities, thought to be more trustworthy than Russians. A number of such formations, all under German leadership, achieved division size, including a Cossack division with the regular army but supplied by the SS, a Turkish division, the Sumy division, and the Galician division, which has been discussed some already today. I have some description of some of these units that are not Ukrainian, but I'm going to skip them and move on to the Sumy division. The Wehrmacht's use of ex-Soviet Ukrainians included the 10,000-man Sumy division, which fought at Kharkov and disintegrated at Stalingrad in 1942-43. More is known about the Galicia division, and obviously a lot more than I have in my paper, because it was the subject of several addresses in part already today. I will just mention that it was organized in April of '43 in occupied Poland. Soviet forces badly mauled this formation of 16,000 Ukrainians in German uniform at the Battle of Brody, July 1944. After further serious losses near Lviv, a desperate Himmler permitted the unit's reorganization in the fall of 1944 as the 1st Ukrainian Division. After a stint in Slovakia, it made its way to northern Italy by the war's end. The Cossack, Turkish, and Ukrainian divisions accounted for only a fraction of the Soviet Union's national minorities in German uniform, and not even all of these groups in enemy ranks, and this, of course, has already been pointed out as well. At least a score of other ethnic populations of the USSR could be found dispersed in small units throughout the Wehrmacht: Finns, Byelorussians, Crimean and Volga Tatars, Kalmuks, North Caucasians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijani, and others. Russian collaborators did not play nearly as large a role in German ranks as did various Soviet minority nationalities. I'm going to say just a little bit about the Russians just to give a basis of comparison with the Ukrainian and other ethnic minority experience. For the war, probably well under half of the total Soviet military collaborators were Russians. Second, because of the Germans' special fear and loathing of them, Russian volunteers were recruited in quantity later than other Soviet nationalities and were relegated to the least responsible positions. From 1941 until well into 44, their slots were usually support roles. When Russian combat units were formed, the Wehrmacht carefully scattered them throughout the ranks. And of course, this was the experience with ethnic groups as well for much of the war. When a German-sponsored Russian Liberation Army under ex-Red Army General Andrei Vlasov finally did appear, it barely reached division strength by the war's end. Vlasov's 11th Hour Army was militarily inconsequential, but Russians in strength did play an important role in the German military effort, not in the front lines, to be sure, but in anti-partisan warfare. Here, their help was enlisted early and apparently amounted to something. Vlasov was fond of saying it takes a Russian to beat a Russian. He never really received a chance to prove that, but a goodly number of Germans appreciated the sentiment as demonstrated by their liberal recruitment of Russian POWs to fight Soviet partisans. The Soviet territory Germany conquered proved too vast for effective occupation, especially with the forests and swamps of the western Ukraine and Byelorussia serving as perfect guerrilla bases. The Wehrmacht quickly turned to native collaborators to help counter Soviet resistance behind the lines. By the end of 1942, the Wehrmacht employed, it is estimated, about 500,000 ex-Red Army men in its anti-guerrilla operations. Most of them apparently Russian, although ethnic minorities were engaged as well. Then again, I have some descriptions of anti-guerrilla elements that were a variety of nationalities, many of them Russians, but I'll skip that section and move on to mention just one that's Russian but nevertheless has important implications for Ukrainians, and that is a rather notorious collaborator by the name of Rodionov. Poles and Jews especially had reason to dread the appearance of Rodionov's troops, but one act set Rodionov apart from Kaminsky, another important member of the Russian collaborator element involved in anti-guerrilla activity, and that was this particular character's redefection in 1943 after the tide had turned against the Germans. Moscow rewarded this erstwhile traitor with the Order of the Red Star for the overnight creation of a partisan region in northeast Byelorussia. And the point for me mentioning him here at this point is that this was the last straw for Hitler, and he ordered that all Eastern units be removed from the Eastern Front. He still kept them in German uniform, but moved them all over Europe after that. Line crossing was no isolated phenomenon. Soviet redefectors, either unaware of the harsh reception awaiting them or dreading it less than remaining in Wehrmacht ranks, multiplied in proportion to German defeats. Hitler viewed the large-scale redefection or defections as confirmation of his low opinion of Eastern nationalities and ordered Osttruppen units disbanded or transferred to another front. Some collaborators, especially Heavies, remained on the Eastern Front, scattered throughout the German army, up to 12 per company, but the great majority were moved to other parts of occupied Europe in the early fall of 1943. They were transferred hither and yon, literally from the fjords of Norway to the islands of Greece. Earlier, Soviet nationals in German uniform had seen service even farther south in Libya. The tides of war now split the Osttruppen in every direction, into Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, Crete, and as the war concluded, into Italy, Austria, and Germany. In 1943, France became the destination for more Osttruppen than any other single country. There were 115+ thousand dug in by D-Day of 1944 in France. Allied forces were dismayed to find former Soviet soldiers among captured Germans. At least low-level Allied officers were amazed at this. On the other hand, American intelligence had amassed voluminous data on the Osttruppen, not only head counts, but precise knowledge of unit movements, current locations, even troop morale. But this information rarely filtered down to frontline units after D-Day or before D-Day. And therefore, there were American and Canadian and British troops who were stumped by German POWs who could not speak German in some cases. If American and British officers knew anything at all about the volunteer units, they mistakenly labeled them part of Vlasov's army. And this meant not just other Russian units, but also Soviet ethnic minority units were labeled under this one category in many instances through naivete and lack of information about the situation. Vlasov's army became more than a contrivance of German propaganda only fleetingly at the close of the war and not on the Western Front. Vlasov's army received the most publicity and the least combat experience, boasted of more and amounted to less than most ex-Soviet contingents in Wehrmacht ranks. Throughout most of the war, Nazis of influence viewed this movement merely as propaganda. Serious consideration for anti-Stalinist Russians and a viable military capacity came only as a last-minute act of desperation. The organization and training of Russian forces under Vlasov's authority did not begin until November of 1944, and only one division ever became operational. Pieced together from odd Russian battalions, recent POW recruits, and the remnants of Kaminsky's guerrillas, the 15,000-man formation fought briefly and ineffectively along the Oder River in mid-April 1945, then moved south against German orders. In a bizarre ending too incredible for fiction, these Vlasovites helped Czech partisans drive the Nazis out of Prague in May and then surrendered to the U.S. Third Army. Soviet collaborator forces under Vlasov then were inconsequential, but at the same time, no nation in Hitler's path provided the Wehrmacht with as many recruits as did the Soviet Union. Certainly, its citizens did not find the black logic of Nazism any more appealing than other Europeans. On the contrary, the Slavs, whom Hitler dismissed as subhumans, had more to fear from Germany's berserk racial determinism than any group save the Jews. Rather than any positive attraction to Wehrmacht enlistment, large-scale military collaboration on the Eastern Front stemmed from the size of the Soviet POW pool to begin with. In addition, the absolute wretchedness and brutality of their incarceration, and in addition to that, the grievances of many who had suffered under Stalin's rule. If all the diverse auxiliary and fighting formations are included, perhaps 1 million Soviet soldiers served in German combat ranks in World War II. This army of the damned, as an American documentary styled it, amounted to the largest military defection in history. As to ethnic distribution among Soviet nationals abroad in World War II, the displaced were most likely not to be Russians. This was the case for Ostarbeiter, POWs, military collaborators, non-returners, and those ultimately repatriated. And the largest single contingent was Ukrainian. For example, Ukrainians accounted for 52.6% of all non-returners who had held Soviet citizenship prior to World War II, but constituted only 16.5% of the Soviet population of 1939. In comparison, Russians amounted to 14% of the post-war immigration, yet 58.1% of the total Soviet population of 1939. Several factors help account for the disproportionately large non-Russian, especially Ukrainian, representation among Soviet nationals abroad. First, Russians sometimes, but Ukrainians regularly, suffered heavy losses under charges of bourgeois nationalism, especially in Stalin's purges of the 1930s. This made Ukrainians and other minorities less hostile to Berlin than Moscow, at least initially. Second, Wehrmacht Army Group North, in direct control of the Germans' one major region of Russian population, vigorously resisted deportations to the Reich because the military commanders of the Wehrmacht in that region recognized that forced labor drafts fueled the partisan movement. But in the South, the Army had less control over occupation policy, and consequently Nazi manhunts netted hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians or more. Third, the Germans occupied the entire Ukraine for a time, or virtually all of the Ukraine for a time in World War II, whereas only a portion of the Russian population had to endure German occupation. Dramatic as the story of Vlasov and other military collaborators may be, altogether they accounted for only a fraction of Soviet nationals caught up in the German war effort. Millions more, civilians as well as POWs, had no choice but to work in the Reich's factories and fields. In 1942 alone, Russia's invaders commandeered 2 million Soviet nationals to work all over German-occupied Europe. For the war as a whole, Germany mobilized between 2.8 and 7 million Soviet forced laborers, close to 6 million being a likely figure. Better than 750,000 of these perished from mistreatment and wretched conditions during the war. In looking at repatriation statistics, it is well to note that the great majority of Soviet citizens being returned to the USSR had not collaborated with the Germans. Red Army men captured in Wehrmacht ranks accounted for only, as I estimated, some 17% of Soviet citizens going home after World War II. Even among military repatriates, collaborators constituted less than 1/3 of the total. That is to say, 71% of surviving Red Army POWs had refused to join German ranks despite vigorous recruitment and horrendous camp conditions. And 83% of better than 5 million repatriates were not collaborators, unless forced labor is defined as collaboration, and that, to be sure, is unthinkable. If I could offer a brief concluding judgment of the collaborator phenomenon, it would be this. Some who cooperated with the Germans, without question, were anti-Semites and were despicable in their treatment of Jews and others. Others did not share their captors' racial perversions, preferred life to death in POW camps, and fought against Stalin rather than for Hitler. Simply put, there were collaborators and then there were collaborators. Without an ounce of sympathy for the opportunistic, ruthless Kaminskys, I would point out that other Soviet soldiers chose German uniforms to avoid starvation or a bullet in the head. It is important, then, to differentiate among collaborators. The very reason I chose the word pawns for the title of my study of Soviet displacement and repatriation in World War II was to emphasize the plight of so many who had scarcely an option or a prayer caught between the likes of Hitler and Stalin. Thank you.